Oh, those aren't real. Those aren't real. The ones on the back.
Okay, it's sort of last call for Ottilia. No Ottilia. All right. Well, she had a reserve seat. She was early on too. Harvey, why don't you take one against the wall up there? Look. There's one up there. There? Right there. You're going to announce, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. You're going to announce, and this is all the books that are left. Isn't that great? I don't know. I don't know yet, but maybe. These are $18 in tax. There's a hardcover with a dust jacket. It's I forget how much it is.
28.
28, but there's only a couple copies of those.
Are we ready to go?
Not till I get back there. All right, folks. Welcome to Bird and Beckett. I'm going to do pretzels on you now. And Whiteside is here. Steve Shapiro is going to do the honors introducing her. I just want to warn you to behave. No. I'm sorry it's so crowded. We've exhausted all the seats. I'll need an aisle during the show along here and behind those two tables. And we have some books left, but we'll order lots more too. And Ann lives right here, and we'll meet you here and sign it for you if you don't manage to get one. Okay, so I think I'm gonna get out of the way, but wait till I get to the end there and sit on the controls. And do use that mic. Hi, folks. All right, we're all out. Okay. So let's see here. And okay, Steve.
Can people hear me? Yeah, I guess so. Ellen and I have known Ann and Jonathan for many, many years. So we were aware of her journey, and then we read the book. And people have paths and they have presence, and sometimes people pursue their paths and their paths. And Ann's journey just moved me incredibly. I don't want to talk about it much because she's going to tell you all about it. But when I read the book, I thought, we should have a day at Bird and Beckett. So we're all here. Thank you for coming. Please turn off your cell phones and open your hearts. Ann Whiteside.
I can't believe how many people are here. I love. It's just overwhelming. And to see you all in the same place is also overwhelming. But I hope we won't disappoint. It's been a very long, arduous trip, and many of you have supported me through all of it and have seen this book through its early, awkward adolescence all the way through to now. I feel it's like a boat that's taken off and I have no control over it anymore. But so many of you have helped me in so many ways. I can't even, oops, the lights went out. Is that okay? Oh, okay. And I have a huge list of readers in the acknowledgement section, and most of you are on it. So thank you, thank you. I never thought this would be published. In the heart of the pandemic, I had gotten a lot of rejections, and I said, I just can't handle another rejection. So I quit. And then I translated it into French bit by bit. I had a friend in France who was in her 90s, and she was feeling very trapped at home. And she said, if you translate one chapter a month, then I'll fix your translation. So we worked on that for a long time. And then in many ways, serendipity, this British publisher came and offered to publish it. So one of the reasons it's so hard to get a hold of is it's a British publishing company. And publishing has become the strangest beast, as many of you who've published books know. Now there's a supply problem. I mean, then there's a Brexit problem, and there's all kinds of problems. But here it is. First, I want to say Eric's work as a community organizer is just extraordinary. This place here, he's created. People walk in the door and he knows half their names and what they like, and never takes a vacation. And this bookshop is a community place and not to speak of the jazz. Every week there are jazz performances, so it's an extraordinary place, and it generously gave me this opportunity. So I'm going to try to just read and not do a lot of blah blah blah, but. The title, The Moon in Splinters. So this is my uncle Maurice. I grew up, his British name was Morris, because in England you say Morris. So I grew up with this picture on my grandmother's bureau, and she lived right next door. She was from Ukraine, a Ukrainian refugee. And nobody talked about him. We weren't supposed to ask about him, and we knew that somehow this was a sacred, there were lots of secrets. So to see this picture on all these books is almost spooky to me. It's a very private picture. On top of which he told my mother he didn't like this picture. He looked weak. So, but I showed this picture. So I eventually went to Europe. After my mother died, I started looking into all of this, and I found women in their 90s who had been in his resistance circuit. So he was a British soldier who got recruited into a British spy agency that was sent into France to prepare for the Allied landing, and they were sent alone. So it was a kind of guerrilla operation. It was called the Special Operations Executive. And my uncle went, and he was underground for a year. Then he got arrested, sent to Fresnes, and then ended up at Buchenwald for 14 months, where he was 23 years old when he died. He wrote a book of poetry in Buchenwald called Leaves of Buchenwald, which Otto will know this is inspired by I can't think of his name. Walt Whitman. Leaves of Grass. Well, his is Leaves of Buchenwald. And the poems are, they're lyrical, they're love poems, they're about nature. And we realized that part of my question, I had two main questions. What happened to the group? Why were they betrayed? And the second question was, how could he survive in all that time in Buchenwald? And the poems are part of the answer. So I want to read. The title comes from one of his poems that he wrote about the moon. And he says in it, and imagine he's in this barracks in block with beds piled on top, 4 people to a bed, just horrendous circumstances. And he writes a poem in which he says, I opened my window and the moon blew in, and now she lies on the floor in splinters. I opened my window and the moon crashed in, and now she lies in splinters on the floor. And then he says later in the poem, the moon lies in my heart in splinters. And a liquid delight ripples through the cool night. So he found a way of transcending. And I asked myself, what is the moon? And I realized that when you say moon is in splinters, it's shattered. What shatters? Hope shatters. Well, there's something about the moon which is away from us, and it's not participating in our horrible mess of a world which we are all feeling. And I'm feeling every morning we wake up and we have a moon and it shatters. There's a kind of thing about hope. So this book is essentially someone whose hope did shatter, but in the course of his work, he managed to participate in a movement that got rid of a regime which was transforming France's values, France being our Constitution is based on French values. Liberty, equality, fraternity had turned into this fascist work, patriotism, family. And family means women have no rights. They can't wear pants in the street. So many of the things that you see in the Vichy regime are now part of the MAGA program. So it's, I think, in many ways relevant to find a civilian movement in which ordinary people tried to figure out, what do we do about this? One of the things they talk about in France is that there was this thing called attentisme, which means waiting around. Let's just wait and see. And we know what that feels like. We know now. He did this, he did that, we don't know what to do. And so I think it's instructive to see people who took their social networks and tried to build a movement, and then little by little became a movement which actually did manage to liberate France. So that's the moon part. I want to read a little. So the chapters are all based. He had many names, code names. He was Uncle Morris, and then he was Girard and Eugène and Martial. He had a bunch of code names. The last chapter is number 44438 because he was in Buchenwald, and that was his prison number. And so this is the beginning of chapter about Buchenwald. It says, "This is the story of Maurice's poems, pages of ash that flew up and over the conflagration that consumed him, and so many other uncles, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters." So the fact that his art survived, and last year in France, I went to I organized a conference in Toulouse, and we had a troupe of young actors reading his poems. And they were all so excited to hear who he was. Those poems did survive, and we know that art is one of the things that does survive. So it's important. So secondly, I wanted to just read, because he was 20 when he joined the army, and 23 when he died, 13 days before the liberation of Buchenwald. So there was a lot of grief in my house, and we didn't understand it, and I only began looking at it after my mother died. But this was one of the reasons I was inspired to investigate. One of his he was actually his chef, in France, a lieutenant who was higher up than him. And he says, "It was amazing," his name is Peter Churchill, "it was amazing to see this slim, scholarly, sensitive, and artistic youth on his own home ground. His quiet assurance and the way both men and women twice his age accepted his calm orders left a profound impression on me. In the normal hierarchy of a regiment, Eugene, Captain Maurice Pertuc, would probably have been a colonel by now. So large was his command, and so great the respect in which he was held." One more quick about his character, which in the course of the book, I didn't really know him. I just knew him as a lot like my mother, and a mystery. I'll show you. Can't see very well, but this is a picture of my mother and my grandmother, and I'm the baby going, "What's going on here?" And anyway, my mother looks a lot like him, so partly it was trying to find out who she was. But just to give you a sense of his character, when he was in Fresnes in the prison, he passed, on the way back from interrogation, he passed another prisoner. And after being in Fresnes sometime, Grégoire, this is one of the radio operators who he knew, saw Pertuc in the corridor as both were being returned to their cells from interrogation. By singing the words, Pertuc was able to tell Grégoire that his brother and sister-in-law had safely returned to England. So just the courage and the ingenuity and the imaginative capacity. This is a poet. He wasn't a soldier. He was a bad soldier. But he was a warrior poet, and to me, that was something I wanted to investigate. So I'm going to read you a little about the atmosphere in our house, the silence. And this is something that many families who have trauma in their background, typically, and Naomi's the one who told me this, that that the research has been done. When you have war trauma, the first generation doesn't talk about it. The second generation doesn't want to upset the first generation. And it's not until the third generation that people start investigating. Some people don't want anything to do with it, and others, like me, are obsessed. Anyway, mentions of Uncle Morris were rare. Over the years, a trail of crumbs. He had composed a symphony of burps. He loved the word paraphernalia. Cousins described him as a pince sans rire, with a deadpan sense of humor, mischievous. He smoked cigarettes in the bathroom with Cousin Leo. He was said to have been arrested with a list of contacts. May 1945, my cousin Mike Perchuk, who Anna his wife is here, Baba's nephew, my grandmother is Baba, then 13, remembers when the news arrived that war in Europe had finally ended. Mike, 13-year-old Mike, burst out joyfully, "And we didn't lose anybody." His father, who had just learned about Maurice's death, slapped his face. And one of the things I say is the rest of the family felt that slap. I was 19 when Baba died. I missed her wobbly voice, her soft body, her cozy old world cosmos, terribly, achingly. A decade went by. One day, my siblings and I opened a box of her letters, many of them about Morris. That night, each of us felt sick, dizzy, palpitations. The box went back in the attic, and that was that. And I'm sure many of you had experiences like that. I began teaching adult immigrants, drawn to older refugee women who shouldered inconsolable loss and trauma. Their vulnerability and self-deprecating humor reminded me of Baba. I drew pictures of them, made sculptures of soft, old women's flesh in corsets. Thanksgiving 1990. It's sharing time at my daughter Nina's nursery school. Children are intoning, "I'm thankful for my bear, I'm thankful for my doll." 4-year-old Nina pipes in, "I'm thankful for my Uncle Morris, who died in the war." I'm dumbstruck. How does she know? She grows terrified of anything to do with death and the Holocaust. I am unwittingly passing this on. And that was part of my motive for doing the book, was to dig into this and find out what were the secrets, and many times I found scary things and almost quit. But fortunately, I got to the end. Okay. The organization that Morris worked for was called the SOE, Special Operations Executive, and they, as I mentioned, Churchill was very worried about the Germans crossing the Channel and coming to England. So he was an admirer of guerrilla warfare, and he decided to set up this group to, he said, set Europe ablaze. And the idea was to send in agents by themselves to support the resistance with funding, arms, etc., intelligence. Over its 4-year existence, so some of my text some of it is informational backstory stuff. Some of it is very personal. I realized I had to draw people in because nobody knew Morris. Why would anybody read a book about him? So I decided that it was going to be this trip that we all took, a mystery, to find out who he was and what happened. And my father had written spy books, so I was inspired partly by him. Yeah, he wrote a book about a triple agent who worked for the Swedes, the Americans, and the Russians. And I grew up with that at the table all the time. So over its 4-year existence, SOE employed over 10,000 men and 3,200 women, sending agents to Europe, North Africa, and Asia. It was run by mostly upper-crust British men from offices at 64 Baker Street. Think Sherlock Holmes. Agents came from all classes, nationalities, and persuasions. People deemed suitable for intelligence work, daring, smart, independent thinkers, bilingual, and culturally able to pass as natives. So Maurice was perfectly bilingual and bicultural, so he was a good candidate. Or else versed in the more nefarious arts, safe cracking, falsifying documents, handling explosives. Together, they made a motley crew of stodgy bureaucrats, soldiers and rebels, dreamers and cynics, improvisers and strategists, idealists, eccentrics, and cheats, all living up to their reputation as the Baker Street Irregulars. Equipped with its own department of disguises, SOE was part theater troupe, part paramilitary outfit, and part band of outsiders. Very romantic and interesting, all these characters who were non-military. Well, sort of, because in fact, the SOE became a model for the CIA. And I knew very well what the CIA did. So I say charming and romantic as SOE agents were, I have to remind myself their mission was deadly, like the American CIA, which modeled itself on SOE. The CIA has a brutal history. I witnessed firsthand in my Guatemalan students the unspeakable suffering caused by CIA-backed regimes, their assassination squads, and dirty tricks. But in my imagination, SOE was somehow different, more idealistic, a family affair. I remembered a little book on Baba's bookshelf with a modest, worn cover by Maurice's boss, Colonel Buckmaster, a name we pronounced in hushed tones. The title, They Fought Alone, confused me as a child. How could anyone fight alone? So children grow up with these peculiar things and questions, and you have the rest of your life to figure it out, right? Yeah. Okay. So I set off on my trip. My mother died in 2006, and she had spoken to her night nurse stories about Maurice, stories we had never heard. And so in my mourning for my mother, I decided to try to find out things, and I looked on the internet and found one thing after another. It was extraordinary. And it was just at the time where many of the survivors were still alive. They're not anymore. So many of the women I talked to were in there. I interviewed 4 women who were in his circuit. And in the course of this, I was invited. I was on an academic talk in London. And I've been corresponding with Duncan Stewart, the man in charge of the SOE archives. Hearing that I'm in town, Duncan has invited me to lunch at the Special Forces Club. With no clue to what that means, I follow his directions to a small side street off a posh square in Knightsbridge, an unmarked brick townhouse with a black door, behind Harrods, he told me. I've checked my suitcase at Victoria Station, but I'm carrying my gypsy rucksack. At least I'm wearing expensive shoes and a serious skirt. A man in a waiter's outfit opens the door. The interior is like an East Coast brown house, but up about 50 notches. There's a bubbly party going on in the adjacent room, mostly lanky men in dark suits. To justify my unlikely presence, I explain, I have an appointment with Mr. Stewart. Ah, yes, the waiter says. A moment later, a handsome, broad-faced man in his 70s appears. He's deceptively mild-mannered, tactfully showing me the coat rack where I can hide my worn rucksack. Above the coats, a staircase lined with frame pictures of striking, daring-looking young men and women. The SOE Hall of Fame, says Duncan. We'll look at all that. But first I want to introduce you to some people. He shepherds me into the bubbly room, which turns out to be a book signing party. The dark-suited men drinking and hovering around the table piled with hardcovers. All very hale fellow well met. I've lucked out. The book, The SOE and the French Resistance, is an anthology of obituaries from the times. And the 2 people I most want to meet are in the room. M.R.D. Foote, who was the famous historian of the SOE. In the 1960s, there was lots of controversy about the SOE, and so the Foreign Office hired him, he was the Oxford historian, to write the official history, which is considered like the Bible. And since nobody else had access to the files, and his word was God. And so he was there, and then another historian writing about SOE agents. Only 2 other women in the room. One seated across, at this time I'm a lowly ESL teacher from City College, and I'm feeling very out of my depth. There are only 2 other women in the room. One seated across the room notices me and works her way over. I'm Sybil, she says, holding out a languid hand, Michael Foote's wife. Duncan introduces me as the niece of Maurice Perchuk of the Prunus circuit. I've never been this niece before. My mother's brother, I managed to get out, choking back tears. Mrs. Foote looks nonplussed. Well, she says with a breezy tone, I saw you and didn't know you, so I thought I must introduce myself, and now I have. She says with satisfaction, then moves on to better pasture. Pulling myself together, I try stiffening my upper lip. This is going to be hard. Duncan steers me to Michael Foote, introducing me again as Maurice's niece. He's professorial in a dark blue suit and looks to be in his 80s. Hats off to you, Professor Foote says with a gallant flip of an invisible hat, then quickly turns to Duncan about another subject. I try butting in. You know, my father went to speak to Colonel Buckmaster in a nursing home, so Colonel Buckmaster was the head of the French section, otherwise known as F section, and he's the one who wrote the book, They Fought Alone, who was like a god in my house. Oh, Buckmaster, Foote replies. Charming, delightful man, not a great manager, he says cheerfully. This name I'd heard spoken in hushed, revered tones my whole childhood. Duncan asks Foote about, a great irony. After the book was published, I went in October, it was September 29th. I went to England and did a book launch at the Special Forces Club. Michael Foote is now dead. And I went back and I said, Michael Foote got it all wrong. And it was very satisfying. And part of the reason was my father had done this interview, and he was a scribbler. He didn't do recordings. And after he died, I was going through all of his papers, and I found this peculiar notebook page that had on it this kind of like code. And it said, September 28, 1988, 86. Martin worked in F section. Martin. Oh, that's Martin Perkins. That's my uncle. It turns out Michael Foote was 86 in 1988. Did a very good job indeed. He has been much in my thoughts. At the bottom of the page, it says, Foote book contains many inaccuracies. We never wrote anything down for 4 years. So this was like my Rosetta Stone. And I take the reader through each one of those points. What happened? What does this mean? What is it? And so because a mystery helps turn the pages, right? Yeah. Okay. So we're still at the Special Forces Club, and Duncan asks Foote about Maurice's radio operator, Marcus Bloom. Apparently, a photo of Maurice was found on Bloom at the time of Bloom's arrest. Stewart wonders how it could have passed SOE censors. This is the first I've heard of any of it. Bloom and Perchuk were careless, Foote tells me, repeating the story about using loud English in a Toulouse cafe. It dawns on me simultaneously that Foote has just insulted Maurice and that I am in deep water. Mercifully, a great clinking of glasses silenced the room, and they all sit around and talk about, he says, Michael Foote, I'll just read it. Okay, on cue, these upper-class gentlemen dutifully form a circle like kindergarteners. A man wearing a bow tie and looking like Bertie Wooster's dotty uncle, ahems. Milords, ladies, gentlemen. It's the first time I've ever heard that address. Normally, he says, we don't encourage our members to talk to the press, knowing laughter. But we've got some distinguished members of the Times here today, and we do want to sell 10,000 copies. So tell your friends. As artistes, he says, dripping with British sarcasm, we appreciate being appreciated. Michael Foote's turn. Being brave in groups is one thing, he begins, but these men and women were alone in the field. He gives the example of a Norwegian SOE operative who single-handedly changed the outcome of the war by sabotaging the heavy water plant in Norway, disrupting the German nuclear program, and setting them back 3 years. The Norwegian lost his life. Lots of applause. Suddenly, I'm depressed. The stark contrast between this gentlemanly applause and the daring ghosts on the stairs. But I want to introduce you to some of the amazing and wonderful people, because I think we can be inspired by brave souls who got themselves up out of their wait and see-ness and took action to change, to try to change the course of things. And it was 2% of the population. Do you know in France there were 40 million people and 5 million denunciations? And so 2% of the population is a very small number. But by the end of the resistance, there were many, many more. So this was in 1940, 1942. By 1944, everybody was pretending they were in the resistance. So anyway, right. So one of the people I ran into was this man, Lucien Feynman, who was he was looking around to what can he do. He was Jewish. He was from a secular family, but he wanted to do something. He had been interested in resistance work, but mostly found, quote, people who talk too much without anything either convincing or solid, which we know all about. Early in 1942, Villa told me, a reliable person whom you can trust will soon get in touch with you through my brother Lazare. A boy came to see me, so Maurice was 21 at the time. He introduced himself as Gérard. And he says, so through my friend Villa, a cousin I mentioned, I've come to see you. And he starts explaining it's a matter of organizing a circuit in the Toulouse region, very insular, with precise mission that was better not to talk about, which I learned only later on. And it was a matter of organizing, first recruiting partners, friends, to expand the structure and the circuit. So I got Feynman's memoir, and in it he talks about that he was part of the Scouts. So we're looking at organizations that were civic organizations. They weren't military, or how did they know each other? It was doctors through their patients and everything, that how they recruited. So Feynman had been a regional director of the secular Boy Scouts, the Éclaireurs de France. But once the anti-Jewish laws of 1941 passed, he decided to join the Jewish Scouts, the Éclaireurs Israélites de France. He felt that not joining the Jewish Scouts would represent a kind of denial. He went to explain the switch to the regional director of the secular Scouts, Marcel Petit. Dr. Petit, a 54-year-old veterinarian, was a passionate scout leader in his spare time. He would take his children's scouts out to the countryside. He would load up their backpacks with arms, and he would go through the German checkpoints and they would be singing scout songs. And the Germans, who believed in physical exercise, let them all through. Dr. Petit told he was intensely secular, even extremely left-wing progressive. Dr. Petit told Feynman he admired his decision and told him, given the racial laws of Vichy, you'll be putting yourselves in the lion's mouth, but it's your choice. Feynman became regional captain of the Jewish Scouts, and his job was to find families, schools, and churches willing to take Jewish teenage children of refugees in the occupied zone. So France was divided in the occupied, unoccupied zone, and in the occupied zone, they were being rounded up and sent off to Auschwitz. So their adolescent children were left hanging. So Feynman took them and went around and found families to take them in. For Feynman, who'd grown up in a secular family, the EIF was his first exposure to religious life. I had to eat kosher and try to not to offend by eating a ham sandwich in camp, he said. So these relationships are people who are not all on the same page anyway. I had one of the women, I asked her, I said, well, this guy was a communist. Why did you work with him? She said, we didn't care their politics. We needed to get rid of the Germans. We took anybody we could. And that was a coalition. Of course, it fell apart after the war, but our message now is we got to do coalitions. We can't be looking at whose politics. So, okay. So I wanted to read you just a brief section on Buchenwald. One of the things I was most worried about was writing about concentration camp and how trite it is to try to say anything about something which is so beyond any of our experiences. And I took a lot of courage from Toni Morrison and her Nobel Prize speech, in which she says, "Do not try to capture the cataclysm. You refer to," and I decided to use mostly words of people who were there. And fortunately, the French, who were all put in a car to give the French prisoners in 1943, were all put in the same cattle car, as you remember. And they all arrived at the same time. They all have 4443 something or other, their numbers. And they were put in quarantine at Buchenwald in one block. It was called Block 48. And so for quarantine, there was a lot of disease around. Remember, Buchenwald was not an extermination camp. It was a labor camp. It was a slave labor camp. The soldiers were off in other parts of Europe, the German soldiers, and they were lacking maneuver. So they took prisoners and had them build arms and all kinds of things. So by this time, there were 88,000 prisoners in a camp that was built for 20,000, and it was a horrendous situation. But they were a lot of these people survived and went on to write extraordinary accounts of all of this. And so, ironically, in the chapter on Buchenwald is where you see most Maurice talking and in action. It's very hard to get him talking when he's in his clandestine life, but I got lots of people reporting on his conversation. So they're in Block 48, and Marcel Petit writes a memoir for his family, and he was a veterinarian. He was the head of the vet school, but he was an extraordinary writer, and he was writing just for his family. And his daughter shared the book with me. So he's in Block 48, and he's talking about Eric, who is the German Block Altesten. The German communist Block Altesten in Block 48 had been in camp 7 years and lost parents and siblings there. In his eyes, says Feynman, this comes from Feynman's memoir, a certain strange glimmer, sometimes of resignation, violence, or even a touch of madness. "If you don't respond to the roll call," Eric advised newcomers, "it will be the end of you. You'll leave by the crematorium chimney. And then forget your past, your social position. Here you're nothing but forced laborers. In other words, nothing. If you hang on to what I've just told you, you can expect to see your country again. If not, you'll finish in the crematorium." Eric's pronunciation of the word crematorium struck Petit as grimly funny. He had to force himself not to laugh at the big bad wolf and the naughty children. But the crematorium was inescapable. It permeated the camp with, quote, "a curious odor, Swedish, cloying, with a bitter and truly nauseating edge to it," writes poet Jorge Semprún, suddenly born on the breeze, that often reached us in the evening through the open windows. It haunted us all night long when the wind held steady. I'm in Salt Lake City. So when I come to the present, I speak in the present. The past is narrated in the past. That's how So Salt Lake City. My daughter Nina's first baby is due. She's right over there. To keep me distracted while waiting, I brought some work, a hardly cheery stack of Holocaust books with titles like The Theory and Practice of Hell. One morning, anxious about the impending delivery, I opened Jorge Semprún's book. The poet has a way of describing things that go right to the heart. Suddenly, my blood freezes. My stomach churns. Shaken, I close the book. I can't even look at its cover. Into my suitcase it goes, zipped, pushed to a dark corner, a toxic mess that risks leaking out, contaminating my grandchild. 3 months later, my granddaughter lies in my lap, kicking, cooing, and smiling. She and her mama leave, and I pick up my manuscript. How can life be both?
where they escaped to.
So the question is background about my mother and where they're from. So my grandparents were from what I now realize was Ukraine. And they were Russian, because of pogroms, they had to leave and they went to England and then they ended up in France. My mother was born in France. Maurice was born in France. Then there was a lot of migrating. Many of you have had this experience yourselves. And they ended up back in France in 1939, which was really crazy. And so when war was declared, my uncle joined up and went back to England and joined the army where he was recruited from. My mother went on to, they tried to hang out what they called the drôle de guerre, which was the phony war. There was this period where nothing much was happening militarily. And then they ended up as refugees in Bordeaux. Bordeaux, when the Germans entered France, Bordeaux was part of occupied France. And they had to get out because they were Jews and they were foreign Jews and they would have been deported. So they went farther down south to Bordeaux, to Toulouse, and my mother started studying at the University of Toulouse, and they lived in a little town, Montrégeau, which was there were so many refugees that they started putting the Jews in small towns around. And a third of those Jews ended up being deported. The French congratulate themselves on having a pretty good record with all of this, but 75,000 people were deported and never returned. And they had camps, they had camps all over the south of France. They had this place called Gurs, where Hannah Arendt was. There were a bunch of camps, and they were just anybody. So the Vichy government, as it began to more and more collaborate with the Germans, they wanted to help deport Jews back to Germany, and they also wanted to get rid of, they had all these, they called them undesirables, which included foreigners, Jews, homosexuals, sound a little familiar? Refugees? Communists, exactly. And they would be, and the French police collaborated. They helped these arrest people and round them up. And my grandparents were living in this tiny town, and they thought that the mayor was protecting them. But I actually went to the archives and looked at the records, and the mayor had put them all on the list of Jews. There was a census of Jews just waiting there to be deported. And it turns out it was my uncle's contacts in the resistance, in the police, that saved them. So my grandparents survived the war. My mother ended up taking a train. My cousin Mike's family sponsored her, and she couldn't get a job because she was Jewish, and she took a train across France, a boat to Algeria, train across North Africa, and then a boat across the Atlantic to Baltimore, and she ended up in New York, where she met my father. So. Questions, please.
So, when I married Mike, first cousin to Uncle Lawrence, and there was kind of a shadow over the story of Maurice. You know, this was 40-some years ago. But kind of like, so he had gone to a cafe and boasted about his exploits in the SOE. And that's how he got arrested, and that's how he ended up in Buchenwald. And so you almost didn't think to ask anymore. And your book, I know it's a harder, more subtle thread through the book to explain, but it's really quite extraordinary that you unravel that and you find out. Maybe you can say.
Yeah. Well, I think with all history, there's evidence. And if there's a lack of evidence, then people build narratives on very small pieces. And people love narratives. So Michael Foot, the historian, he had very little. There was a Official Secrets Act, and the agents weren't allowed to talk about their work. We had a friend who was an agent, and that friend had something against Maurice, and he told him bad stories about Maurice. So what I did was I went through and took the facts of the story and debunked all of them.
And it becomes the absolute opposite of what the shadowy figure, negative, ragadoning.
Well, I mean, I think Otto, you can confirm that there was in the 20th century there were these narratives that there was the psychology, and it was all individuals. So there was a fatal flaw and a character flaw, and that's why this circuit failed. And a lot of the stories are about somebody who wasn't up to task or wasn't brave enough. And the other thing I wanted to say is that the narrative was all like our celebrity culture. It was all about the bravest of the brave. There's a very popular book in France right now called La plus résistante de tous, the most resistant of all. And in this country, the civil rights movement, we know Rosa Parks, we know Martin Luther King, and diddly squat, right? And the fact is, movements are built by many brave individuals, all of whom have character flaws, right? And so this nice narrative. I also was going to say there was another. The man who provided the information that made Maurice look bad, his book was The Bravest of the Brave, or I don't know what. And the book uses Maurice as a foil. This guy did all these things, and Maurice he did bad. He made mistakes, lots of mistakes. What I learned from French people was that the pioneer resistance involved people who were making mistakes right and left because they didn't know what they were doing. They were making it up as they went along. And it involved a lot of risk, but it was if they hadn't done it, the rest of the movement would have had no foundation. So as they grew over the 4 years, they became more secure. But and Maurice made mistakes. But how do we write history? How do we understand history? And how do we understand courage? And I grew up with this man as he was our cornerstone. We had to, if there was genocide happening, we had to do something about it. I joined the Guatemalan News Information Bureau because I knew you couldn't just hear about genocide and not do anything. And we're faced with this right now in Gaza. What are we doing? And he said, there was to me. So, yes, I was very worried about finding out bad secrets. But I felt, well, basically once I got into it, I couldn't get out. I had to keep going. And the story turns out to be, as Anna says, I'm not going to give you the answer because it's a mystery.
But what I loved were the quotes she did have about people who were with him and things he said. And he was extraordinarily kind, ethical, moral, brave, poetic. You'll love it.
Yes.
What was the most startling thing that you found out that was the biggest surprise to you?
That's a great question. Well, I think torture was very hard for me to handle. And reading accounts of people who were in prison with him, it was brutal. And I wasn't sure I was up to it. But I have to say that those were my biggest fears. And fear is what drives all this. Fascism is all built on fear. And I felt that if I could, I found that, of course, people under torture gave names. You were only supposed to go for 24 hours without giving names. So the startling thing was that everybody did morally complicated stuff. You couldn't. I mean, how many of you have seen The French Village? It's a slippery slope. We're not paying attention to what goes on. Look at racism in this country. I mean, so startling, for me, it was something about realizing that I had thought there were innocents in all of this. And that was, but it also made me somehow less scared. Because I always thought if I were tortured, I'd give in. Well, of course you would, Yeah.
Now that it's an object that can be held in your lap, Is it done? Or what remains?
It's a really, really good question because Susan's written a book too, as many of you have. It's a very strange feeling. I don't know if you feel this, but I feel it's sort of taken off on its own, and it's kind of like an kid who's gone to college. I can't change it. Yeah, Irene.
How far is it taken off? Are you getting any nibbles for Scream? It's so cinematic.
What's hilarious is my publisher said, he said, you know, it needs to be a film. He said, an older woman, said an older woman, most of the books are just about young people. An older woman looking into all of this would be a good story. Yeah, Peter.
Maurice's poetry, is it going to be translated and published?
So his poetry was written in English. There are 3 poems written in French which are gorgeous, and I actually translated them. I didn't bring the book, but there is a book that was published in 2003, and we're hoping to publish them again. And not all of them are as beautiful as that one, but as many people know, young poets are uneven, and so many of them are so beautiful. I'll read you one that I translated. It's in the last chapter. Let's see. I tasted the sun at the end of my garden. It smelled of jasmine and yellow gooseberry. I found a tear on the lashes of a rose. I was looking for something else, a shadow, maybe a charm. Yes, I was looking for the threshold to that faraway dream where the smell of morning pulses in the leaves. Here's another one. A perfume hangs in the air, a golden scent and wild, the smell of landscape where the day leans out. The moon with its crazy hair, its cool milky gaze, bathes my drunken dream in blue tides. Elaine.
Well, first of all, congratulations. And I think
We've been working on books together, so.
yes, we have.
Yes.
And I think, and this is relevant to that journey that we've been on. I think you wove together so well Morris's history with your quest to unravel it. How did you decide on that structure, and rather than just have his story? Or, how did you decide how to weave together those 2 stories?
So, first of all, I got so much criticism for doing that. People said, you do the history or you do the memoir. And some people said memoir and other people said history. I realized that I needed a guide to take you through because I didn't have enough. Just a reconstructed story would have been very static. So I decided I needed to bring some of and I also felt I wanted to open it up to not just this context, but to a bigger context where families have secrets, families have worries that they've inherited, they don't know what to do with, and the joys and fears of all of that. And I thought that was a good dramatic. And I didn't know how to do it.
How did you?
Well, Anna was saying that it's better than it was. Sometimes it was, but I felt, first of all, in terms of mood, each chapter I wanted a mood for the chapter, and I knew that some of the dark passages I needed some lightness to them. Like was reading about crematorium, and then I go to Salt Lake City with a baby. It helps the reader process. We read the news in the morning, and then we want to watch a junkie show or eat candy or something. We can't just do this. And so I was trying to, mood-wise, have it be. And how do you distinguish the 2 voices? Well, I decided to do all my journey in the present, and then the rest in the past, which helped. But then I ran, yeah, and then
Well,
yeah.
the shoe boxes.
The shoebox.
Boxes, it seemed like.
Oh yeah, yeah. I had 6 shoe boxes of things from my mother. After my mother died, we found these 6 shoe boxes full of stuff. And I didn't. The last shoebox, I thought they were all the same, so I didn't. I don't find that's the last chapter. I'm not going to tell anybody about it. Yeah, but the question of voice is a very important one. I wanted the reader to feel it was their discovery. I wanted it to be like a mystery where you get fed some clues and you think one thing and then it's not. And then you think another thing, and then you're scared. There's a passage where I'm going through a tunnel and I'm claustrophobic and I'm doing my first interview, I did the first interview the day before my grandson was born. He just turned 14. That's how long it's been. Anyway, I'm going through the tunnel. I hate tunnels, and all the doubts crowd in. I'm saying, what have I done? I'm running who wants a Holocaust story? We had enough of these. You can't write all these things. All my doubts and fears come because I loved Mouse. Mouse was kind of my, was kind of my inspiration. Mouse and Toni Morrison. I know nobody can claim her because, yeah.
It's really a discovery of your mother, don't you think? Can you talk about that?
Well, I mean, like many of you who have immigrant mothers, there were so many things about my mother I didn't know or understand. You know that. And he was so like her, and they were so close, and she carried her grief all through her life. And she told her night nurse before she died, she thought about him every day of her life. And we never heard anything about him, very, very little. And so I thought in mourning her, I wanted to find out more about what she went through. I criticized her because we in the 60s thought you have to feel things and everything. And my mother was very much about, let's be pleasant. Can't we just be pleasant? And I thought she was not courageous until I went back and found out what she lived through. She would tell stories about the war that were all about, we played games and stories about hunger. It was all about hunger. Yeah. But I learned so much about her, and I found letters that she wrote my father, and she was a wonderful writer, and I didn't know that. Good storytellers are all around us. If you open your eyes, I mean, finding these memoirs and how much when people pour their stories out to their families, they're not being fancy. Sue, you know this. Sheila, you know this. They're stories. There are lots of stories, and we live with. I think we need stories now to help us. Yeah. Sheila.
So, if Eric runs out of books to sell, where can we get the book? How else can we get the book?
I know. Well, so it's the problem is that there's some kind of a bottleneck. There's an American printer, and they seem to be printing it on demand. So Amazon will have it and not have it. But if you order with Eric, we can order them and they'll come. And so the paperbacks are $18, is it? And the hardbacks are 29 or 28. Yeah.
Let's support our independent bookstore.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, we don't want Amazon. We hate Amazon. Yeah. 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 And another big round for yeah. Who is asking? Oh, Beau Soleil.
Yes. So one of my culture heroes for a long time is Charlotte Delbo, who I'm sure you're aware of. She was a resistance fighter. She and her husband were arrested. He was executed a few weeks later. She was part of a transport to Auschwitz. All women. Few of them survived, but they formed circles in Auschwitz to protect each other. If somebody fell down, they would circle that person so that guard didn't see them. fall down and they wouldn't be sent to the death block. But one of the quotes that I always loved from Charlotte Delbo was, "Try and look, just try and see." And I think that's what you've done with your book, is that same kind of spirit of try and look, just try and see. So.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Thank you for being in this very small place. And I love you all so much. You're my mishpucha, as we say in Yiddish. All right, come and breathe and eat.